Hello and welcome to today's European report. Here we are in the heart of the European Union, in the European Parliament, and in today's programme we will be discussing the economic success of Israel's startup nation and how Europe can benefit. In this programme today I'll be joined by Bas Belder, a Dutch MEP with the European Conservatives and Reformists Group. Welcome back to the programme.
Thank you.
And also Tomas, Sandell, founder and director of the European Coalition for Israel, sponsor this programme. Welcome to the programme. And we also have a special guest today in Dr. Andreas Kelling, who is the director of the IBR Institute of International Business Relations in Steinbels University of Berlin. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you very much.
Firstly, I'll start off with you, Tomas. Today's programme we're doing about Israel's startup nation. Maybe you can describe for our viewers what that actually means. Many have heard it, but no one really knows what it is.
Well, again, it's good to be back on the program. I'm especially happy to have Dr. Kelling here, who is an expert on the startup nation. So I'm sure he will be able to explain much better than anyone else of us. For me, it's the obvious reality that Israel today is a very dynamic nation economically, financially, in terms of innovation, in terms of entrepreneurship, in terms of economic dynamism, something that we sadly lack in Europe, and I think that's why it's so important that the nations of Europe can learn and benefit more from Israel, the Jewish state. Let me also say that this is nothing new. When we look at the Jewish communities in Europe, we always see that they brought in these same qualities. So that is why someone like the Secretary General of the United Nations, the Portuguese Antonio Guterres, he said, well, when the Jewish communities left Portugal and they went to the Netherlands, that was a loss. That was when things started to go downwards for Portugal, and when Netherlands really benefited from this. You can even say startup people at that time. So this is nothing new, but I think what we've seen nevertheless over the last, I'm not sure, 20, 30 years in Israel is such a remarkable success story. So we should really learn more from the Israelis, and also let our viewers know that Israel programs don't always have to have a team when we're against something and because the international community is so critical, but where we can simply just share the successes of the Jewish state.
Absolutely. And Andreas, warm welcome to the programme. It's great to have such an expert and specialist in business and in Startup Nation. Can you give us a little bit of background information into your background and how you became interested in Israel and also in Israel's high tech?
Well, it started in 2003 when I have been invited by Steph Wertheimer to offer our global MBA program in Israel. Steph Wertheimer, I would call him, he is kind of the father of entrepreneurship in Israel, setting up one of the largest companies, which was bought by Warren Buffett eventually. And I like the idea. However, it wasn't a success story. We failed in selling the MBA program in Israel, but whilst living in Israel, I also all of a sudden realized that Israel is a fantastic case for entrepreneurs, business executives around the world. We need to invite them to come to Israel. So instead of taking Israelis abroad, we then started inviting one business delegation after the other to come to Israel in order to experience the startup nation. And that's what I'm doing, and that's what I have been doing for the last, I would say, 13 years.
Excellent, excellent. And Bas, it's always a pleasure to have you on the programme. Isn't it nice that we get an opportunity to do a programme that looks at Israel's remarkable success story in terms of startup nation, in terms of its digital economy, and also how Israel's leading the way in terms of information technology. How do you think, being a member of this parliament here in the European Parliament, how can we convince other, say, moderate or indifferent MEPs to embrace Israel's success and really realise that Israel is a blessing to nations and a blessing to Europe, and by embracing Israel's high-tech know-how, Europe can benefit?
Yeah, thank you. A very good question, and I must say that is, I'm here since 1999, and now I'm vice chair of the Israel delegation. The last 5 years, my former mandate, I was the chair, and my purpose was indeed not to restrict the EU-Israel relationship to the conflict. On the contrary, to see what's going on in Israel. So every trip we made to the Knesset, and that is every year, we included in our program startup issues. Amazing innovations we saw. We went to companies, we spoke with entrepreneurs. So, and up till this day, my dear colleague from Italy, who is now chair, and I'm supporting him, does the same. What can we do practically is that, as much as possible, to bring MEPs with our delegations from all political parties and to see how it works. One concrete example, last month we had here a big international conference I was hosting with the European Christian Political Movement, a room full of interesting people, also citizens and also MEPs, and it was on the Balfour Declaration and beyond the future of Israel, and there was an amazing presentation of innovation firms, how Israeli innovation research can help blind people or people that are very restricted with vision capacities, how they can improve their daily lives, that blind people can read newspapers, can read books, can speak with each other through innovational tactics and instruments. So there's a great contribution. I must say, and I believe it from my heart, every Jew is a miracle of the Lord, and together Israel is a millionfold miracles of the Lord. And what we see, the blessings of this miracle of the Lord, is this innovation.
Absolutely. That's very well said. It's incredible to think, isn't it, that a small nation like Israel that's constantly on a war footing is listed on the NASDAQ, and has more companies listed on NASDAQ, excluding China and also the United States. According to my notes here, has more venture capital per capita and more startup companies than any other in the world. In your opinion, why is Israel such an success in this area?
A disadvantage sometimes can become an advantage. I once talked to a friend of mine who said, you know, you Germans, you're like a vessel in the North Sea. And we're like a little rowing boat next to it. There's a slight breeze coming. This breeze is like a major threat to us, whereas to the vessel it doesn't mean anything. And I think that is the core of the success to the startup nation Israel. They always had to deal with problems. Not only look at them, but solve them. I mean, we talk about 70 years, but if we go back 120 years when the first Jewish immigrants came into Israel, what did they find? They found rocks, sand, sunshine, and a tiny little lake that was supposed to provide water. Well, what do you do with it? All the other neighbors had oil. If you go to other countries, they have natural resources. So they had to build something out of nothing. Yeah. And if you then ask yourself the question, if you're 70 years the country now exists, they celebrate their first day of independence. What happened? A war started. Yeah. They had 800,000 traumatized citizens coming from just released from the Holocaust, whereas the others have been well-educated soldiers on the other side. And we're talking about 20 plus million if we just look at the population. So they permanently were challenged to solve problems, and that is the same today. This solving problems. So I believe that is the root. If we just look at it, and obviously you can say, well, they have a special ecosystem that they have designed, which supports the development of startup and finding new ideas, disruptive ideas, as they would call it, in order to change the world. But it all starts with that they have a hunger to solve problems and not to look away.
Yeah, that's incredible. I found that inspirational. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Tomas, Israel has more scientists and tech professionals than any other nation in the world. And in 2016, Israel's startup nations raised 4.8 billion in venture funding, a record that year. How can Israel use her economic success for diplomatic advantage in the field of diplomacy?
Well, Simon, I think this is the case already when we look at Israel's relations, say, to Africa as an example. We know it's a match made in heaven. Israel can provide, again, to quote Dr. Kelling, solutions to so many everyday problems in Africa, be it in agriculture, be it in sanitation, but also in security issues and water sanitation. Obviously, when a nation look at Israel, how should they relate to Israel? How should they vote, say, at the United Nations? There are many things that plays in, geopolitical considerations. But I think more and more also people are looking at the cost benefit. What can we, how can we partner with this nation? What can this nation bring to us? And more African nations, to just stick on that continent, are realizing that Israel has so much to offer the African nations, and it makes sense for Africa to have better relations with Israel. But not only Africa. I think this goes for globally speaking. We know that China, India, Netanyahu just returned from India, and they have the same experience. But we should never forget, sitting in the European Parliament, that this also goes for Europe. Europe desperately needs this know-how which we can find in Israel.
Absolutely. And Bas, isn't it time that the European Commission and the European institutions like this Parliament finally recognise that it's actually Europe needs Israel, Israel doesn't need Europe? And what I mean by this is that Europe needs Israeli security and know-how, and now with Israel's startup nation, and Israel's leading the way in this new digital age that we're living in, surely this needs a realization or a reframework of European policy towards Israel. What's your opinion?
My Israeli friends, counterparts in the Knesset, in government, academic institutions, I admire them. Open minds, and you can discuss with them, you can learn a lot, are very balanced. They say we need each other. We need each other balanced. But that said, my conviction here and my experience here is a lot of people from the European Commission surely know that we need Israel in all aspects, and also say it openly. But the contradiction is they do pure political things that are endangering just the state of Israel. And we should speak up in the parliament that you cannot have, on the one hand, with one lip saying we are friends and we are allies, and do things that are not the work of allies. For example, what we are doing with Hezbollah in Lebanon, our weak stance there with Iran and so on. So we should be very clear towards the Israelis that we want to do business with them and want to protect them, and there should be a state of Israel. Okay, but then not only words, but what is your precise policy? And that means when looking at this attitude, when you look at the conflict and so forth, we should support all the programs from the Israeli side to normalize the situation, to have business-like situation that Palestinians can work, and we should not let go. Even worse, we should not give money to everything that goes to that works in the direction of endangering not only the Israeli state but Israeli lives. For that is that's the human aspect. And all in all, Europe knows we need surely Israel, but we should not be. We should then very clear in all aspects, all political aspects, and that also means no labeling, try to normalize, and that is the big question. I know it from daily experience. I have now an excellent assistant policy advisor there who knows both sides, and her message is quite clear. People who want to normalize the situation are demonized by irresponsible Palestinian politicians who are helped here by especially leftist groups and colleagues, and that is blurring the image of Europe towards the Israeli side.
Yeah, absolutely. Andreas, you said before in this program that you've taken European business CEOs to Israel. Can you share with us what their experience was and what they found in Israel and how this has inspired them to learn from Israeli know-how in terms of startup nation?
Well, I think one can start at from a very simple perspective that if they haven't been to Israel, they come and they realize, listen, there's no war. Yeah, people are living very normally. It's a very friendly country. It's a country that you just must love. They go on the streets and they would see, well, they're in Arabic and they're in Hebrew. How come? Discovering that Arabic is a national language in Israel. And we thought they are persecuted. Then they go into the store or into the cafe and they're being serviced by an Arab waiter. So this is, I would say, the very normal life that they would experience. And then they realize, listen, this is becoming incredible. We would take them, for instance, to Teffen. Teffen, an industrial park that against the Wertheimer set up, where also ISCA, this metal cutting tool company, has been set up by Steph, which Warren Buffett, as a matter of fact, bought. The first international investment that he did outside the US. He bought this right there. And these people are being exposed to that. How in the world would you buy a company which is just 10 kilometers away of the Hezbollah, where it's sitting? We had a neighbor, an engineer, Eres, who worked in Iskar, and he told us how these missiles were flying over Iskar whilst during the second Lebanese war. So they see this. They see that the people haven't stopped working even during war times. They see the quality that is coming out there. They sense the hype that is in there in doing business. They see how Jewish, how Druze, how Muslims, how Christians are working together. It changes their mind. And besides that, obviously, I mean, we set the stage so that they not only go in there in order to establish contact with a company, but that they also understand, let's say, the whole setup of this startup nation.
Yeah, and Tomas, we're talking about Israel's incredible success in terms of information technology, startup internet companies. One of them is that excellent sat navigation app called Wiz that is sold recently. Yeah. We find that Google, Facebook, Microsoft all have research and development centers there, and yet Israel is blossoming in this field, and sadly Europe lags behind, certainly in this particular field. So why is it so stupid of so many EU member states to start to adopt the BDS movement, the boycott, divestments and sanctions, knowing that ultimately they're not going to be blessed and they're not going to be financially enriched by doing so?
Yeah, it's true, and obviously I think in all fairness it needs to be said that I think the official, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the official position of the European institutions is to say that we do not support BDS. Obviously what you have is civil society within these nations which are, very problematic campaigning, and not at least Christian organizations, and this is of course very sad for us. But coming back to what Bas Belder said earlier, you then have the issue of the disputed territories, the marking of goods from the disputed territories, which is so counterproductive. And this is EU sanctioned policy, and this is something
fueling the conflict.
Fueling the conflict. So in an indirect way, they are, as Speaker of the Knesset, Elif Stein, said recently, there are contradictive messages coming out from Brussels.
Precisely.
So, and I think we need to bring the governments to account and say, well, on the one hand, you say you are against BDS, but the policies that you are implementing are in fact undergirding this BDS movement. And what we've been trying to do, and this is also why we wanted to bring this up on the program, is to say that the antithesis, the antidote to BDS is really to say that, listen, if we want to solve problems in Europe today, the Jewish people is a light to the nations, it says in the Bible. And this is a very practical expression of what it means to be this source of inspiration and answers. And I think you said it very well, that the Jewish people are problem solvers, and this is what makes them so great.
Absolutely. So we're down to the last 4 minutes of the program. Bas, I have to ask you, do you think that something can happen here in the European Parliament that that can actually show Israel's technological advancements in the field of information technology, Israel's success in startup nations, and to encourage CEOs of European nations to meet here in the European Parliament, to meet with their Israeli counterparts, to build closer relations between Europe and Israel?
Absolutely. That means who are in charge, the delegation for the relations with Israel should invite them. That happens and will continue to happen. For example, the Committee on Trade, on International Trade, should not support BDS like maneuvers I've seen there here in the Parliament, but should encourage them. International trade, that is in line with what the Commission is doing. Also, the Committee on Industry, startup nations, and I can say when MEP should be willing. For example, I'm a member of the Agriculture Committee, and we had an excellent contribution from the Israeli side on agricultural innovation in this Parliament. Excellent. And all the members there were really not only surprised, but we very enjoyed this presentation, and that makes sense. And that is quite concretely, and then you are building up, and that we should really do our utmost to create this atmosphere, doing business, and I like Israeli counterparts because they are open-minded. You can discuss, and the Parliament is talking, is exchange. And what we should always do here in the Parliament is there is a new publication from the Israeli side, the Institute of National Security, about BDS, and also a chapter on Europe. We should study that chapter, and that we should really honest. We are speaking about two-state solutions. That means not only a Palestinian state, there is a Jewish state, and we should full underline that. Then the Palestinians also know that is reality already 70 years.
Absolutely, well done. Andreas, I mean, Israel sold Waves, which is a brilliant sat navigation app, for billions of dollars. And Israel's selling some of her amazing successes in terms of apps for Samsung's, iPhones, and what have you. Do you think Israel will then develop into a stage where Israel has its own big brand companies, such as Facebook and Google and others?
If we look at this, on average, I think a company becomes 4 years until it is being sold. And I think that's the contribution of the Israeli society to the world. They are the ones that come up with completely new ideas. They think completely different. They're not like the Indians. You tell the Indians and they do something as you tell them. The Israelis start thinking out of the box. They come up with solutions no one would have thought about. And that's why you see these giants today coming to Israel and buying technology, or at least partnering, or just being in accelerators, as Microsoft does it. They just stand there, they just invite prospective companies to get to see what they're doing and how the future is going to look like. So I don't think that the Israelis will be successful in, let's say, on a larger scale, to grow companies. That's not their task. That the Germans do that, the Finns do that the Dutch, and that the British do that. They must change the world by means of new ideas, doing things differently, and making this world a better place.
Gentlemen, I just want to thank you so much for being my guests on today's programme. And Andreas, thank you. Really enlightening and fascinating insight you've given us today. So I really appreciate that. And thank you. Your excellent work here in the European Parliament, and the excellent diplomatic work you do as well, Tomas.
Pleasure.
Thank you. So I want to thank you for watching today's European report here in the European Parliament. We've learned about the incredible success of Israel's startup nation, and this is something that Europe should embrace if Europe wants peace and prosperity. So thank you for watching today's programme.